All right, let's get started. Good morning. I'm Kirk Russell with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. A lot of friends in the audience, thank you for joining us this morning. And I don't see any eye patches, so it looks like we all survived that reminder not to look straight into the sun yesterday. You're here because of the, I assume the title, Where's the Money? And it's funny, when I saw that, I thought back in the 80s when Wendy's was advertising. That was back before you had recordings and you had to watch commercials. You had the Where's the Beef? Remember that gal? It's kind of like that. Where's the money? All right. The title of this includes long-term stability of funding could threaten a secure water supply for future generations. Lately, the availability of state funds to borrow money for water projects has been unpredictable. And I think the focus of that statement is accurate in that severance tax has been problematic over the last couple years as a reliable source of funding. And we'll talk a little bit about a lot of other funding opportunities other than CWCB's funding source. Next question is, what revenue streams do utilities currently use to finance water projects? And how might we diversify funding and avoid that reliance on the problematic variability of severance tax? And is it time to consider statewide water bonds is in this session, and certainly other revenue sources and the possibility of them. To introduce the gentlemen that are up here with me, this is Mike Brode with the Colorado Resource Water and Power Development Authority. Alan Matlows, sorry, with George K. Baum, Vice President of Public Finance, and Dick Brown, lobbyist and consultant, focuses a lot of his work for Pikes Peak Water Authority. So I'm going to run through a little bit of the story of CWCB's loan program to start with, where we are today and some of the issues that we deal with the state in financing water supply projects. CWCB is involved in a lot of different stuff. Some folks know us as a lender. We're involved with flood control projects, interstate compact relationships with other states, in-stream flow, a lot of environmental folks within CWCB, and then the planning side, the group that worked hard to get that water plan developed. The financing branch of CWCB, real quick, we talk about projects that we typically see are around a minimum of $100,000. We recently requested the legislature to approve a $90 million loan to the Windy Gap Firming Project with the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. But you can see the interest rates are very favorable. We do subsidize market rates for our loan program. And we try to give a scale, and that is traditionally we can do about $40 to $50 million in new loans each year. We're seeing a little stress right now on the funds and the demand. And I've shared with folks that it seems to us inside of CWCB that the water plan has generated a lot of interest, not only in some grant funding, but also moving projects forward. And so we're seeing some significant projects coming in looking for financing. CWCB works, and I'll talk in general terms, out of three different funds. The Severance Tax Perpetual Base Fund is a revolving loan program, and it's valued at about $400 million, and we circulate money in and out of that to borrowers around the state for water supply projects. And the significant difference between the CWCB's loan program and Mike Brode's program at the Water and Power Authority is we tell folks if we can be involved with bringing water to the treatment plant, but you really need to contact the Water and Power Authority folks to distribute that and treat it. And so that's kind of in a general sense, the guidance we provide. The other pot of money we work with is the construction fund. It's also a revolving loan program, but it's really the workhorse. It operates all of CWCB's efforts. We do not receive any general fund money. It's a cash funded program, and so the interest earnings out of these two accounts is what helps us continue to do what we do. And then each year there's $3 to $5 million in grants that we're able to approve. And you can see at the top the severance tax revenue that comes into the CWCB. We receive 25% of all of the revenues from severance tax into that perpetual base fund for loans. On the far right side, you can see another 25% of severance tax goes to the Department of Natural Resources, and they utilize that for several programs and agencies within DNR, of which CWCB receives about $1 million each year for some operational activities and real small grants. We do some research grants out of that to some higher education research folks. And you can see the red box indicating that last year, I think they received 0 out of the Tier 2 funding. And so the way, and I'll show you the next slide how this looks, but Tier 2 is really what's left over after Tier 1 receives full funding. And here's the distribution. I had indicated the red part of the pie is the CWCB's loan program and the severance tax. The 25% to DNR, and then the last 50%, or the other 50%, is to Department of Local Affairs. And you can see the list of DNR agencies that receive partial funding out of that 25% portion. And again, the Tier 2 funding, I believe this year is down around 20 to 30% of normal. So we're still seeing a significant squeeze on the funds coming from severance tax. And I show this slide. The vertical axis is millions of dollars, and I focus on our 25% that CWCB receives for the loan program, but you can imagine if you just multiply this times 4, that would be the revenue that comes in annually from severance tax. And again, this is 25% of that total, and over the last 8 to 10 years, we've seen about $40 million into the loan program. And the difficulty is, if you were trying to budget for this variability, it would be very difficult. And we are fortunate at CWCB to be able to invest this money and then really attenuate that extreme swing that you see in the market as that revenue comes in. DNR, I know they struggle, and that's why they have that Tier 1, Tier 2, that in those times of down around $20 million, once they reach, if it gets below that, they can't even fund Tier 2. And so that's what you see in that estimate of 2017. It dipped down to around $10 million, which is why they had to dip into the reserves in order to even cover the Tier 1 funding. I guess my message from this is, again, we're really fortunate at CWCB to be able to invest this and not have to track this up and down in a budget sense. With that said, if we continue to see something under $40 million, it will cause us to have to adjust how much we do have available for lending and also for grant and operational activity. Some real quick projects that we are involved with, and we've got a slew of them. We do a lot of river diversions, and I know you in the water community are aware that the diversion structures on the river take a beating every year, and they're about 120 years old, so we see a lot of replacement and repair work done around the state on river diversions. And we certainly have an opportunity to find enlargement opportunities, whether they're existing reservoirs or reservoirs that may not have been used recently. We would like to get them back in service. So we do entice borrowers to rehabilitate existing reservoirs if dam safety has restricted them. We've got a reduction to those interest rates that we can help repair reservoirs, but we do enlarge a few around the state when we can, or help with. There's been a lot of buzz about the $20 billion number that the State Water Plan included, and we all that that were involved in this to find a number that would give us an indication of the need. That $20 billion surfaced, and we're not sure if it's 20 billion or 40 billion, but it's a big number, and the need for additional revenue streams was part of the water plan and identifying them. And so the gentlemen are up here are part of a committee that has come together to look at ways to find additional revenue sources aside from severance tax and some of the existing revenues. Recently, we've been fortunate that through the wisdom of the CWCB and the investments that they've made, back in 2007, the board made a loan to the city of Aurora, and because the interest rates have been low and actually dropped since they took on this loan, they were able to pay that back to CWCB. And so that made some additional revenue or additional funds available. And so the board decided the water plan was complete. We really need to inject some money into its implementation. And so, and the average revenue stream from severance tax has been fairly decent at $40 million. They decided to inject $25 million into the water market in the form of some grants and funding opportunities. And here's the lineup through the annual projects bill. $10 million was provided this last year in the projects bill for the Basin Roundtable folks. A lot of activities at the Basin Roundtable level were stalling because of the severance tax revenue shortage. And so the board decided let's supplement that activity with $10 million. They also, the water plan identified that watersheds around Colorado are extremely important, and we need to find ways to advance some of the planning activities in relation to watersheds and stream health. And so we hope to provide $5 million over the next 3 years to watershed and stream restoration, health, and planning. And then the last $10 million is a grant program that just started this last year, and we hope to do this for a couple more years. And we're in the process of reviewing a lot of those requests right now, all in the name of advancing the water plan. The last item that I wanted to talk about that's new to CWCB is a desire to regionalize water projects. We hope to help communities come together, work together. A regional project is certainly going to be more powerful than a bunch of individual projects working independent. And one of those obstacles seemed to be the difficulty bringing the individual entities' financial health into one project. And this idea of a loan guarantee fund, and we're still in the process of developing how this might play out, but in essence, we set aside $30 million to assist those with weaker credit rating that may have difficulty in the market. If there's a pooled finance opportunity, we feel the project will be stronger, and this may be an opportunity that the state can use to help leverage some of its cash funds into a larger project. And that's it for my presentation. I'm going to, hopefully it didn't run too long, I'm going to turn this over to Mike Broad.
Good morning, and thank you, Kirk. I'll keep this rolling because we do want to involve you all, the audience, and some questions that we have some canned questions that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, and the point of that is to involve you on this discussion. So I'll try to keep this brief. The Water and Power Authority, I see some faces I know and some new faces, which is great. Most of you know or have heard about our programs. Water and Power Authority was created in 1981 by statute. The legislature created the authority to help develop the water resources of the state, and it's evolved over the years. The first part of our history was doing storage studies. So if you have a storage idea, a water storage idea around the state, we most likely have a study on our shelf. If you do, come see us. We've got it. And our main objective is is to provide low-cost financing for water and wastewater projects. As Kurt mentioned, we typically handle those aspects from where the water is delivered to either the drinking water treatment plant or wastewater treatment plant. Although we have finance, because we can sell bonds, we have finance, for example, Reuter Hess Reservoir in Douglas County. So we can issue water revenue bonds as well. That's a little small, my apologies, but we basically have 4 programs that we operate. A small hydropower loan program. If you have a small hydropower project, come see us. We do provide some feasibility grant monies. Like I said, we can issue water revenue bonds, but our 2 biggest programs are those first 2, the Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water Revolving Fund. So Kurt gets his funding through state sources. The authority is the state's recipient of capitalization grant monies under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Our funding comes from Congress through the EPA, and that began on the Water Pollution Control Revolving Fund in 1988, basically, and then on the drinking water side, 1996. And so later on, we're going to talk about risks with respect to the future of those revenue sources to help finance projects for us. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about that and again, talk about those risks as we see them. We do work with partners on those 2 revolving fund programs, Water Quality Control Division, which I'm sure most of you guys know, and then Department of Local Affairs as well. This slide is to provide food for thought for a question that's going to come up later about affordability. This, we went back and did a little research the last 20 years. This is just water rates, not sewers, just water rates as a percentage of the state median household income, because we'll talk about this again within that idea of affordability. How affordable is water currently? And if you look at that trend line, it really, water rates have stayed pretty consistent with the increase in the median household income. It hasn't really risen as you might expect. So I think this helps us gauge what is affordable in the future for raising revenues. And so we'll drill down on this a little bit more as we go along here. And again, the idea is to involve you with questions for us. I think that's the theme of this conference, and Doug would stand up here and tell you that, is the membership directing us as to where to put our efforts. So I think with that, so we can stay on track, I'll turn it over to Alan Matlos. Alan?
Good morning, Alan Matlos with George K. Bauman Company. So in addition to the wonderful programs through CWCB and the Water and Power Authority, some folks go to the public markets and borrow money, and that's the space that I operate in. I have 3 quick slides just to kind of get the conversation going here about things that I think are happening in the world that might affect the funding of water projects. And I know that, because I got this information earlier, I know at least 3 of us in the room that are doing remodeling projects right now. And anybody else doing a home remodeling project? Okay, you might have noticed that the cost of that has gone up slightly over the last, where's my forward button here? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Thanks. Over the last few years. And the same thing's happening in public projects. But one thing that we're blessed with is really low interest rates. This is a chart of the last 10 years of interest rates, and we're still pretty low. But what if, in addition to increased construction costs, if we had a bump up in interest rates? That could really affect the affordability of these projects. So just a little fun fact, if you're borrowing for 25 years and your interest rate goes from 3% to 4%, for example, that's an 11% increase in your payment. Okay? So all of a sudden you have 11% less money if you want to keep your rates the same. So what happens if we do see a big increase in interest rates? How does that affect the projects? The other thing is there's, considerable number of bonds that are issued every year for water and sewer projects. There's this little trend, billions and billions of dollars across the country. What if there were an interruption in the market for bonds? What would we do? Unlike the programs that were discussed previously, assuming the project is fundable, there is no limit on the amount of money to finance these projects, just, depends on the interest rate. But what if there was a market interruption like we had in 08 or 09, and all of a sudden it became more and more difficult? What would that mean? And then the last one is just Google, if you Google citizens upset with water rates, you get 22 billion hits or something. And even though we know it's affordable, and compared to other expenses, water's not expensive, there are just people all over the country upset about their water bills. And what if there is an inability to raise rates to fund projects because of public outcry? How do we affect those? How does it affect us? And we'll talk about those things in a minute. And I'm handing it over to Dick.
So how do we advance the slides? Oh, got it. The arrow. So I get to talk about some of the funding concepts that I've been working on. Unlike Kirk and Mike, who have a fairly clear mission and objectives that they work within, I get to be the creative guy. I get to think of all the stuff outside the box, which then frequently brings Kirk and Mike gales of laughter and hysteria as they roll around and things like that. So taking off for a couple of things. One, my portion really started on the basis of what happens if we don't have the severance tax revenues flowing into the state, as Kirk has talked about. What happens? Because if you think about our water funding, it's much like being a one-crop economy in Latin America. If the price of bananas drops 2 cents on the world market, the treasury of that country goes into the toilet. So the same thing happens with severance tax. And unfortunately, with severance tax, the state of Colorado has virtually no control over what happens because of global market conditions, as we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. So that presents some real challenges for predicting and doing any kind of anticipation of budget needs. And the CWCB and the staff do an extraordinarily good job with all those kinds of variables that are out there, because the swing can be 20 to 25% from year to year, quite dramatically. So my other question that I had when I started reading the state water plan, and I was fortunate enough to be a participant in some of the chapters, is what happens if water rates aren't enough, much as Alan has just talked about. We're seeing an increased anxiety, I think, nationally about water rates and affordability, but I think you're also seeing people come around to the thought process that water is somehow a human right. And you'll frequently see comments made about the United Nations protocols where they have called for water to be recognized internationally as a human right. Now, what they didn't say, and in fact they made it very clear, is they didn't say it should be free. It should be affordable. And that's a very important thing. But as Alan had pointed out, if you're looking at the cost of housing, if you're looking at other kinds of things going on, you're in a situation where affordability becomes quite severe. And we'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. So I don't know if you can read this, but the caption on it says, they're economists without frontiers, and they're there to bring new fiscal techniques to the underprivileged natives. So when I look at going forward and how I structure my thinking, I'm looking at 4 different kinds of sectors that I think all interrelate with each other. The first one is population growth, obviously. And just as an aside, when I watched the state plan come together, it occurred to me that this is also a treatise on population. If we weren't looking at 3 to 5 to maybe 7 million new people coming in over some period of time, would we actually be having these discussions? And the answer is not to the extent that we currently are. We would be having these discussions. So population growth is important, but what then becomes important within population growth is the demographics. Who are these people? We're seeing young people obviously coming to Colorado. We're seeing older people retire out, and the change in mix of products and services that they buy affects a whole raft of things like sales tax. If you're no longer buying washing machines and refrigerators, which are high-ticket items and generate sales tax, and you're spending more money of your disposable money on services and things of quality of life, which are not taxable, because services are not taxed as a sales item because of the Constitution. That changes the mix of how you think about how much revenue you can forecast and project. So those are important. Values are important. Values show a reflection of how society is changing. So if you have a citizenry that all of a sudden no longer values the kinds of things that we have done for the last 15, 20, 25 years in water, and they want a different mix, you have to factor that in. And this is obviously the group that you hear about as millennials. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that I found when I was doing some other research on millennials. And the last one that I put in there are jobs and occupations. One of the things that struck me as we were putting together the state water plan, and as I said, I was sort of a fringe player. Spent a lot of my life being a fringe player. But anyway, is how does Colorado make a living in 2050, 2070, 2080? Is it going to be the same mix of jobs and occupations that we currently have? Is the resource allocation of water among those going to be precisely the same, or is it going to change? And so those become important. If you think about and you're all familiar with the term gross domestic product, which is a national thing, there's also a gross state product. And if you come back and say, if we did not have the full complement of historical average water supply that would be available, what would the effect be on the state economy? And it could be a pretty sobering discussion once you get into that. So this cartoon says, the two at the shopping center said, when did water start costing more than wine? Pretty quickly. It's going to come around much faster than we all think. So as I started looking at some of the things, I looked for what would be the characteristics of a good revenue source. What could we look at? And I'm not going to go through these in detail because, as Kirk and Mike have said, we want to give you guys plenty of opportunity to ask us questions and things. But I just wanted to throw this slide up to show you. And by the way, I think all these are going to be available on the Water Congress website when the conference is over. That there actually are characteristics. This is not a pig in a poke, that you can actually have some criteria and some things that you start to evaluate things by. And just for one, I will put out there, at the top you'll see unique. And for that, to me, means that the revenue source is not competing. It's not competing for other kinds of uses. And remember, these are most likely going to be public revenue sources. So you don't want to have the new revenue coming in being diverted for Medicaid or K-12 education or transportation. It needs to be unique and dedicated to the needs of water. So as I've thought my way through this, I've come up with a number of things that I've got some degree of research that are going on. I won't talk about these in detail. I'm around the next couple of days. I'll be glad to sit down over a cup of coffee and go through them with anybody that wants to talk about it. But just for example, a fee on beverage containers, soft drink cans and bottled water and stuff, a diversion of state sales tax that's already collected on the sale of water appliances, from garden hoses to faucets and shower heads. One that I like, but it's probably going to cause a great deal of hysteria, would be a surcharge on title insurance policies, because the key to all these is what's the nexus? What's the connection between the revenue source and water? And for me, title insurance comes around and says, what happens if there's erosion? What happens if we don't put money into stabilizing the watersheds? If we don't prevent forest fires and wildfires, what's the effect on market values of real estate? And so you can see there's some other things along the lines. And so I show the guy at the supermarket on the phone with his wife. He's looking at the grocery list and he says, did you want regular bottled water, low-fat water, zero-carb water, or free-range water? I would also say for all of you in the water business that are selling water, you should be proud that you also are doing a gluten-free product. This slide is a really busy slide, and I show it not to talk about it, but to introduce you to a research project that was commissioned and funded by the Nature Conservancy. And this was done by Summit Economics, located in Colorado Springs. I was fortunate enough to have a little role in that. But the commissioned question was, what kinds of revenue sources might there be out there, and can we start putting some preliminary numbers to what those might generate in an annualized basis? And the answer is there's a whole bunch of them. I think I actually need, So these blue lines were the ones that came up quite quickly because the threshold for going forward and crunching the numbers with the economists there was $25 million a year in revenue on a stable, sustained basis. And so these are all things that are out there. The whole study is available from Nature Conservancy. They're continuing to do some work. It's valuable for a couple of reasons. One, it's really good work. It's reliable and stable. The other is to let you know that there are actually people out there thinking about this and starting early on to come up with ideas and concepts. And so for my last slide, which I guess is a little bit to climate change, is that the two people with a surfboard saying, even if the ocean dried up, we'd still have skateboarding. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kirk, our moderator, and be happy, I know all of us, to dialogue with you and answer questions. And all the hard questions get referred to Kirk. So if we look and go, wow, boy, that's a tough question. Haven't got the foggiest. Kirk, what do you think?
Thank you, Dick. We do have a couple questions that we'd like to start with, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Great presentations, and thank you. The first one that we thought maybe would help generate some additional conversation, and Mike Broad alluded to this in one of his slides, and it has to do with how much is too much to pay for water. And during the course of analyzing some of the research that Dick Brown showed on the screen relative to bottle fees, I sat around the kitchen table and asked my children, and I've asked some non-water folks the same question, that bottle of water that you see in the convenience store cooler, and the opportunity to grab a cold, refreshing bottle of water when you're on a road trip or just out and about will cost you about $1.50, $2. And so I've asked around, and I said, how many times you think in Denver you can fill that thing up for $2 out of the tap? And the answers will be anywhere from, 50 times to 100 times, 200 times. That number's upwards of 3,000 times for that same $1.50, $2 that you pull it out of the cooler. The Denver water is where I live. The opportunity to fill that up. So, it begs the question, is the price of water really the controller here? What will we pay for water? I certainly am not comfortable with paying more for anything. I like to keep my money, but there just seems to be an imbalance. And so The follow-up question to Mike, and I'm going to have Mike start with maybe an answer is the maximum just a dollar amount, or is the percentage of income or a percentage of some other number, does it help guide us in how much the value of water is to us in our households?
Thank you, Kirk. First of all, in Colorado, there is no free-range water, so let's exclude that, Dick. Well, EPA will, if you want statistics, and they always paint an incomplete picture. And EPA has a national percentage of median household income that they use for water and sewer rates. The rates I showed you were just water. But they say anything above 4% of MHI is probably not affordable. I think we typically see percentages somewhere 2 to 3%, maybe more. And in some communities, particularly if they're considered disadvantaged, it could be higher than that. And so I would say for the most part, water is affordable. There are some communities, if you get out on the Eastern Plains, that have very expensive water projects where, the water rates or combined water and sewer rates can go over $100. In that particular community, that might not be affordable. So the answer is it depends on your locale and the economy in that local area. Again, when you start getting rates approaching $100, I think there's some sort of mental barrier there that people have with respect to that, although they don't seem to mind to pay over $100 for a cable or satellite bill or for a phone, a smartphone. So, I always see this as partially an education problem about what the value of that water brings to you, and protecting. I think they lose sight of, if you don't have a viable water and sewer system in your community, what does that do to your real estate values? I mean, what does that do to bringing in, new residents to your community? That's a very tough question. What's affordable? Again, we see it where, in some cases, it's very rare that we would turn down a loan application based on rates. We've done it on a few occasions, or we have suggested that they go get some grant funding to help lower that rate increase that's going to be necessary, because we do all kinds of financial tests, and if you cannot demonstrate that you can repay the loan, and that's just a simple calculation, we're going to enforce upon you to increase those rates before we make that loan, before we execute that loan. So this is a very tough question. Again, I think in general, for the most part, water is affordable. But there are some communities where it's stretching folks, their individual budgets. So
let me add to that. The CWCB, as I indicated with our interest rates, we don't just loan to municipal folks. Most of our borrowers, I'll say probably 70% of the borrowers that CWCB has on their books are agricultural borrowers, and so there's a similar question: What rate are those agricultural ditch companies able to, or a debt service are they able to support? And most farmers try to minimize all costs for the benefit of their members. And we have some matrix that we use when we present loans to the board, both on the municipal side and the agricultural side, that shows a general an idea of whether that entity is out of line with their current rates. And again, it really is where are you in the state? A lot of times has a lot to do with how much it costs for their water. And many times on the supply side, when a municipality needs additional supply, many times it's for growth. The CWCB avoids risky loans as you would want us to with tax dollars. We focus on very conservative approach to approving loans. The type of projects are very unique. We research them thoroughly, whether those water rights are strong enough and the project is a wise one. We do subsidize those rates as well for lower income communities versus higher income communities as well. Next question I've got. And this kind of falls in line with what Dick was talking about. What does a non-water related revenue stream look like, and how does that revenue stream compare to or compete with other taxes for schools, fire districts, transportation, etc.? And I'm going to let Dick start out with an answer, and maybe Alan will be able to follow up.
It's a great question. Everybody knows that we have a constitutional amendment called Tabor, and Tabor structures our way of thinking about public revenues. And so you immediately have to come to a reconciliation of whether or not your revenue source is going to be a tax, in which case it falls under all the criteria of Tabor for prior voter approval and other things. If it is not a tax, it's a fee, and there are basically two kinds of fees. There's a cash fee, which falls under Tabor in a curious way because it applies to the budget cap that any governmental entity, state, school district, whatever, can do. And then, of course, there are enterprise fees which fall outside the orb of Tabor. So when you start looking for revenue streams, you kind of start off from the premise that taxation probably is not something that is palatable to the community at large. There's an inherent suspicion of taxation, and even if you get a tax measure through, you're looking at some quirky things about that. One of which is taxation always comes with exemptions. And in water, it's been my opinion for many years that there really should not be any entities or users who are exempt from paying their fair share of fees in order to support the system in perpetuity. So if, for example, the people on the side of the room over here were all tax-exempt entities and the rest of you were going to pay the tax, I guess you'd sort of look and say, well, how much more do I want to pay in order so those people don't have to pay anything? I think it's a tough decision to make. So when you start looking around creatively about revenue sources, you have to work from productivity. There's no point in doing this if you don't generate a significant amount of money that's going to be applied to the projects that you want. And you've got to make sure that that's not going to get diluted, that other things don't get added on. And I think this goes to the essence of Kirk's question, is that if you split that revenue stream, say with transportation or K-12 education or Medicaid, I can tell you two things. One is that they don't care about your water projects. They will be working very, very hard to change that allocation and formula to get as much over for their needs. And those are legitimate needs. They're critical needs to society. So you should not put yourself in a weakened position vis-a-vis those other things. A great example of this is the state sales tax. If you start looking at all the revenues that are added on for special purposes, you can get up to 8-10% very, very quickly on any kind of a sales transaction. And that was one of the reasons why when I looked at an array of possible revenue sources, I did not include a sales tax or adding on to the sales tax for the state and local governments because I don't think it would be a very productive source. So we can ramble on over that one for a very long time, and I'll turn it back to Kirk and see if Alan wants to jump in on it.
Sure, thanks, Dick. I think that the challenge we have is if you're looking at a statewide revenue source, tax or fee, it's always hardest to get things done at the largest level. So the example I always give is education. If you ask, 100 people, 1,000 people, 1 million people, what do they think of the U.S. Department of Education? You don't get a lot of favorable thumbs up. But if you ask people what they think of their child's first grade teacher, they think he or she is the best in the world. So as you get closer and closer to home, it's easier for people to understand and support these kinds of projects. I think that it'll be a significant challenge to try to find a statewide revenue source. And the question out there that I'll throw out to the group is a statewide revenue source really the answer or not?
Okay, I'm going to keep Alan on the hot seat here. The next question has to do with interest rates. We've been enjoying very low interest rates for 4 or 5 years, and we continue to tell borrowers, hey, get in because they're got to go up. They're at the bottom, and they continue to be fairly low. And so the question is, if we start increasing interest, what impact will that have on projects? Obviously, they cost more money, but is it just a math exercise, or are there other impacts beyond just increasing the cost? What maybe could you share with us, Alan? In that
Sure.
regard?
So since 2009, I've been traveling the state, telling everyone I can find that interest rates are going to go up, and I'll admit to the room I've been lying to everyone, because every time we think they're getting higher, they just get lower. Even just this last week, we're seeing rates hit at least getting close to annual lows because of other things going on internationally. We did have a small interruption in the bond markets when the recession hit, where all of a sudden costs went up very quickly for a short period of time. One of the risks is that something happens in the whatever we're calling the federal tax bill that takes away the ability of government to finance on a tax-exempt basis. So that all of a sudden just increases your cost by whatever the inverse of the tax rate is. So, borrowing goes from 4% to 6%. There's still money out there, right? People will invest or people will loan money. But if the cost is higher, then obviously programs like from the Water and Power Authority or the CWCB are going to be more and more attractive. At some point, though, the cost just gets to be too much. And I don't know what that is, but at some point in time, it's just going to get too expensive. And if it gets too expensive, we could see the financial markets start to back away, and then it gets more expensive, and then you're trying to get the project, and it gets more expensive, and it just builds on each other, and then you just can't get there. And so that's a concern. I don't see it now, but depends on what that number is. Mike, do you have a thought?
No, I keep telling people you should have borrowed yesterday. Rates, if you have a project, finance it now. Because there's the risk in terms of which way rates go is only going up. And I've been saying that for a long time too. You're not the only one. Yeah. But at some point they will. And it makes it tougher. The numbers get harder in terms of what you got to charge your customers. So, and depends on what type of. If you're talking about a Denver Water, well, they can absorb that. It's a larger system, but for small systems, that becomes much tougher. So, and you can always say, well, we're a mid-sized credit. We need to issue $20 million in bonds, and you hope 3 or 4, well, maybe 7 or 8 years from now, rates will have gone down and you can refinance it. That's always an option, but there will be a point where people say, you know what, it's just too expensive.
Okay, I want to make sure we leave about 10 minutes for audience questions, but the last comment and question I've got, I showed you severance tax and our reliance on it for a lot of the things that CWCB is involved with. And, I talked about Tier 2 funding, and when that became zeroed out this last year, it impacted a lot of the environmental programs at CWCB, such as species conservation activities. There was a lot of buzz around the inspection, the boating inspections for aquatic nuisance species. I know the Department of Wildlife, CPW, they really struggled in getting those boat ramps opened, and the risk that the state would have in letting some of those mussel species get into reservoirs, and the impact to water users as a result. And so from the state side, the importance of severance tax and the impact of reducing the revenue from that. Mike, can you talk at all about the EPA and the federal funding, and if that is lowered, what kind of impact does that have on your programs?
Certainly, and I would, on our 2 state revolving fund programs right now, we probably have, let's just round the numbers, $100 million of loan capacity annually, let's call it. That's old cap grants that have been loaned out and repaid, and it gets recycled into the program where we can make new loans. And for the last, I don't know, quite a number of years, because of the federal budget issues, we keep looking at that and saying, okay, at some point they're going to stop those capitalization grants. So we're going to rely solely on the repayments from existing loans to make new loans. And boy, I tell you what, if anybody can predict the federal budget, I'd love to have a coffee with you so you can tell me where this is headed, because I just don't know. It is, but I will say this, and this is not intended to be, I don't want to scare anybody, but I think we should all be concerned. I don't know how many of you have seen the Water Quality Control Division's memo that came out on the Safe Drinking Water program and their budget and the cuts they have to make. It is heavily reliant upon those capitalization grants under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that should be a concern to all of us, because they're going to have to cut services, and we don't want that to affect our public health down the road. So there is a risk. It's hard to gauge what that risk is.
Thank you. That's kind of the end of our presentation and question up here. I think I'd like to open it up to the audience if there are any questions of the panel. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Alan and then one for Dick. That's okay. So Alan,
No rules.
look in your crystal ball and look out there, and do you see a 200 basis point move in the next, I don't care, 2 years, 5 years, next administration? I mean, I don't think whether you're an R or a D, my own opinion is I think it would be dangerous to embark on that path because of the national debt. So do you really see any in the interest rates?
Yeah, and because it's not, remember, the short-term rates are controlled by the Federal Reserve. Long-term rates are controlled by outside forces.
Right.
And a whole bunch of things could happen. I mean, we've had 2 discussions in the last 10 days on a national level. Either one of those could shoot rates up 200 basis points. And that's North Korea and Afghanistan. And now, does it mean it's there forever? The problem is it could be higher rates when you want to borrow, which is the problem, right? You got your plan, you're doing your project, and all of a sudden rates shoot up, and you're like, well, I could wait because I think they're going to go down, but they might get even higher, and what do I do? But rates are really low, either on a historical basis or any way you look at it. And at some point in time, in my space, in the public bond space, investors are going to say, you know what, I don't think these returns are good enough, and we're going to move them higher. I would also not be surprised to see an inverted yield curve for those that are really economic wonks here. But that is going to have an interesting impact on what happens if short-term rates go up and long-term rates end up down here, and then they start moving. It creates all kinds of weird gyrations in financial markets.
Does it bother you that most of the Federal Reserve governors are academics and not business people?
Do I have, I'm sorry, how much time do I have? I'm sorry.
Dick, my comment to you is I think we need to all lobby CCI and CML. As a former elected official, I can tell you at least 5 different occasions when I was pushed hard to give up infrastructure capitalization and sewer plant. Give me a break on sewer. Give me a break on water extension. And I think that the elected officials need to stand strong with their constituents that, that erodes your capital base if you start giving it away. And I got to tell you, 2 of those 5 times were county commissioners that pushed on municipal. And so it didn't happen, but, it's always a good cause. Senior housing,
Right. No.
low-cost housing for my kids, whatever it is,
I know.
it has a social piece, but I think the electeds need to somehow learn to stand tall and don't give up their infrastructure if they're providing. And I just want to share that.
Well, I just have a couple of observations. We're in a time period where we're seeing a shift in the values of communities and a lot of important constituency groups. The whole concept of water utility financing for years and years and years was to operate it, even though it's a natural monopoly, as much like a business enterprise as possible. And so the money to operate the system and to pay the capital of debt and everything came from the sales of the product. And the irony is that because a water utility is a natural monopoly, you get economies of scale very, very fast for the more volume that you can put into the system. And in order to do that, the price drops so that you can sell more product. So now we're in a situation which is turned upside down. Number of constituency groups have said, "Oh my God, that's a formula for wasting water." And in order to make the consumer think more seriously about the value of water, let's raise rates. Because the more that they have to write the check for, the more they're going to think about what it is that they're doing. Well, the unintended consequences from that are numerous. Just a couple of them. One is that now we've got a situation which I don't think any graduate business school in the United States would argue that the way to make money if you're selling a product is to sell less of it and to increase the fee. Maybe I've been out of school too long, but that seems to be upside down. The other thing that happens with the economies of scale that we've been able to achieve has been a subsidization of those with lower incomes and those with lower capacity to pay for the true cost that they would do. Well, if you start wrenching out that excess, by definition, those costs are going to go up, and they're going to go back to community groups that are disenfranchised, those with lower incomes, those that are having problem meeting ends now. And you will, and we've seen this over the years with electricity, with natural gas, home heating, and others, there will be a call for lifeline rates. That there will be a correlation between the first block of the rate structure in order to offset those kinds of income things. And that's what, with Alan's slide that he was showing about some of the headlines from around the country, you're seeing that right now. And in other countries, in Ireland in particular, you're really seeing it. So, yes, I think that we need to communicate to the consuming public that we're moving the flexibility out of the system, and costs are going to go up, rates are going to go up, and I will tell you that nobody wants coin-operated fire hydrants. So when you get to a situation where you look at the rates, we have a tendency to think only in terms of what's coming through the meter. But that also includes the overhead costs that you've got not only for the system, but for fire protection, for irrigation of parks and open space and things like that. And we can go on and on and on. But we unfortunately have gotten down to oversimplification of these concepts, and I think that's going to come back and haunt us within the next decade.
I think we're just about out of time. Is there another question that the audience has? I think we're probably in a transition time frame. Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good job.